For almost 50 years, the entire planet held its breath. It was caught in a standoff between two superpowers that had the power to literally wipe civilization off the map. But this wasn't just a story about America versus the Soviet Union. It was also the story of dozens of nations shaking off the chains of empire, refusing to be just pawns in someone else's global game. This is the story of how that massive conflict and that incredible rebellion shaped the world we are all living in right now.
It really all kicks off with this one famous line. Just a year after World War II had ended, Winston Churchill stands up and declares that an iron curtain had come down across Europe. Now, obviously, it wasn't a real wall, but it was such a powerful metaphor for this deep ideological chasm that was splitting the Soviet-controlled East from the capitalist West. And that single line, it defined the next 40 years.
So you have to ask, how on earth did it come to this? I mean, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies. They had just fought side by side to defeat Nazism. How did they become bitter enemies so incredibly fast? Well, the answer is hidden in the decisions that were made right as the war was drawing to a close.
Okay, so you have these three huge meetings. They were supposed to build a lasting peace, but instead they actually laid the groundwork for a brand new conflict. It all started out practically enough at Tehran, with a simple agreement. The Soviets would push the Nazis out of Eastern Europe, and the Western Allies would handle the West. But by the time they get to Yalta, you can see the cracks starting to show. America's President Roosevelt is pushing for democracy, while the Soviet Stalin is dead set on creating a buffer zone of friendly states. And the final break? That happens at Potsdam. The new American president, Truman, demands free elections in Eastern Europe. Stalin flat out refuses, and that was it. The line in the sand had been drawn.
And at the heart of all this mistrust, you had two completely opposing visions for how society should even work. On one side, you've got the United States, championing capitalism. That's all about private ownership, free elections, individual freedoms. On the other side, the Soviet Union is pushing communism, which is centered on state control, a single party in charge, and the idea of collective equality. These weren't just competing economic theories. They were two totally different rulebooks for how to live.
So this clash of ideas got really serious really fast. It turned into a global struggle for survival. It wasn't just a simple disagreement anymore. Each side saw the other as a threat to its very existence. And that fear, it lit a fire under a fierce global competition for dominance, one that was fought with armies, with technology, and with this constant low-level anxiety that just hung over the entire planet.
Pretty soon, these divisions get carved in stone, formalized into two massive opposing military alliances. First up, in 1949, the West forms NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The promise was simple: an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. The Soviet Union's answer came 6 years later with the Warsaw Pact, which created the exact same security guarantee for the communist countries in Eastern Europe. The battle lines were now crystal clear.
And this created the most terrifying paradox, the one thing that somehow kept a very fragile peace: mutual assured destruction, or as it was grimly known, MAD. The logic was chillingly simple. If either superpower was crazy enough to launch a nuclear attack, the other side would still have enough weapons to launch a counterstrike that would be just as devastating. It guaranteed that both the attacker and the defender would be completely annihilated. It's a crazy idea, right? The only thing stopping a nuclear war was the certainty that nobody could possibly win.
And just look at how quickly this threat escalated. It's insane. The US gets the atomic bomb in 1945. Just 4 years later, the Soviets have it too. Then comes the hydrogen bomb, a weapon hundreds of times more powerful. The US tests one in 1952, the Soviets have theirs the very next year. And then finally, the game changer: intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that could deliver that destruction anywhere on Earth. In less than a single generation, humanity had perfected the tools for its own extinction.
This nonstop arms race created a whole new, powerful force in American society. And in his farewell address, of all places, President Eisenhower, a five-star general himself, gave it a name: the military-industrial complex. He was talking about this powerful, permanent bond between the military and the giant defense companies that were making a fortune building all these weapons. And he warned that this alliance of interests could one day become a threat to democracy itself.
Okay, so because that fear of total annihilation made a direct war between the superpowers basically unthinkable, they had to find other ways to fight. So what did they do? Well, they turned the entire globe into their own personal chessboard, using smaller countries as pawns in their great game. And in doing so, they turned local fights into incredibly dangerous international crises.
The name for this strategy is a proxy war.
Instead of fighting each other head-on, the US and the USSR would just pick opposite sides in a civil war or a regional conflict. Then they'd pour in money, weapons, and military advisors to keep the fighting going to help their side win. And the first major bloody test of this new reality was the Korean War. After the Soviet-backed North invaded the South, the United States led a UN coalition to push them back. The war raged for 3 brutal years, it cost millions of lives, and it ended in a stalemate that, it literally divides the Korean Peninsula to this very day. It was a horrifying preview of how a local conflict could explode into a superpower battleground.
And then, just a decade later, you see the same playbook run in Vietnam. Only this time, it was on a much bigger, longer, and more devastating scale. The US got involved because of something called the domino theory. This fear that if South Vietnam fell to communism, then all the neighboring countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, would just topple one after the other. And it was that fear that dragged America into its longest and most divisive war.
But the moment the world truly held its breath, that came in 1962, in Cuba. The US discovered that the Soviets were secretly installing nuclear missiles on the island, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. For 13 terrifying days, the world just froze. Humanity stood right on the edge of the abyss as 2 leaders held the fate of the entire planet in their hands.
But here's the thing. While all of this superpower drama was dominating the headlines, another, equally important transformation was sweeping the globe. The age of European empires was collapsing. Across Africa and Asia, decades of struggle against colonial rule were finally paying off, and dozens of new nations were declaring their independence. And these new countries, they had their own priorities, and they were not about to become someone else's playing pieces.
So, out of this powerful desire for real independence, the non-aligned movement was born. It brought together this incredible coalition of nations, representing a majority of the world's population, by the way, who all formally declared, "We are neutral in the Cold War." Their message couldn't have been clearer. We will not choose between American capitalism and Soviet communism. We are going to forge our own third path.
And this movement wasn't just some abstract idea. It was led by some of the most towering figures of the post-colonial world. We're talking about leaders like India's Jawaharlal Nehru, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Indonesia's Sukarno. Each one of them was a hero in their own nation's fight for independence, and they were determined to protect that freedom on the world stage. All right, this brings us to the end game. For decades, it felt like the Cold War was just how the world worked. It seemed permanent, frozen. And then, with a speed that nobody could have possibly predicted, the entire structure just came crashing down.
So what happened? Well, you have to look inside the Soviet Union. It was rotting from the core. Its centrally planned economy had ground to a halt. It couldn't even provide basic stuff for its people. It was pouring money and lives into a disastrous, unwinnable war in Afghanistan, and after decades of repression, people were just fed up, and they weren't afraid to say so anymore.
And what happens next is just this incredible, rapid-fire chain reaction. It all starts when the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, tries to fix the system. He introduces these new policies, glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, restructuring. But instead of saving the system, he basically opened Pandora's box. People got a little taste of freedom, and they immediately wanted more. Protests just exploded across Eastern Europe. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of the whole Cold War, was literally torn down by ordinary people. And just 2 years after that, the Soviet Union itself just ceased to exist.
And just like that, it was over. But its legacy is absolutely everywhere. The alliances that still shape our world, the borders that still cause conflict, the nuclear weapons that still threaten us, all of it. They're all echoes of that 50-year struggle. So it leaves us with a pretty big question. The Cold War was over, sure, but are its conflicts